Good evening and welcome to the sixth in a series of forums with candidates for office for November 5th. This is being brought to you by Community College and the Citizen. These are shown on Spectrum, Verizon Fios, and ARMA, the Auburn Regional Media Access, as well as played on the college's radio station WDWN 89.1. I'm your moderator, Guy Cosentino. On November 5th, voters in Cuyahoga County will decide whether they want to rehire their current district attorney, John Budelman, a Republican, or replace him with Thomas Turturro, a Democrat. Mr. Budelman is seeking his fourth four-year term in this position. The position of district attorney is a full-time job, and it pays about $196,000 annually. Representing the press today is Jeremy Boyer. Mr. Budelman might want to represent the press today, but we'll give it to Mr. Boyer today, the executive editor of The Citizen. He'll be asking the questions, as he has for the last 15 years, to the candidates. Prior to the taping, we asked both of the candidates to draw lots to see who would go first with their opening 2-minute statements, and that order will be reversed at the end as we conclude this hour forum. The candidates in the order they're sitting is how they will be making their presentations. We have Thomas Turturro, who is on the Democratic and Working Families Party line, and John Budelman, the incumbent, who's on the Republican, Conservative, and Independent lines. Gentlemen, welcome. We're delighted to have you in the studio. Mr. Turturro, you have your 2 minutes to make your opening statement first.
Thanks, Guy. I grew up here in the city of Auburn, and together with my wife, Kristen, have lived here almost my entire life. In June of this year, we welcomed our first child, Benito Turturro, into the family, and I have had a practice of law here since 2010. My mother put herself through graduate school as a single mother of 4 and has worked for the last several years in the Auburn School District. My father, James Turturro, is a minister. He just retired after 25 years with the state as a prison chaplain, having done time at Butler and then Mohawk, among other places, and formerly was of the Half Acre Union Church, and before that, St. Luke's. Raising a family here in Cuyahoga County, I understand that our primary concern needs to be the opioid crisis that's out of control in our community. We need new approaches to deal with this issue, and the solutions that we've been trying for the last 12 years, in fact the last 25 years, as long as Mr. Budelman has been in the district attorney's office, are simply not working any longer. We need to look beyond the borders of Cuyahoga County to see what other communities have done and employ the best solutions that have worked nationally here at home. I also believe that we need to stand by our corrections officers and other first responders, those individuals who put their lives on the line to keep all of us safe every day. Deserve our support and our respect, and they deserve to be treated seriously when they need the assistance of law enforcement. Through these steps, the ultimate goal is to keep our community safe and to make our neighborhoods a safe place so that when I take my child outside to play, I don't have to worry about him finding a needle in the yard. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Turturro. Mr. Budelman, who's on the Republican, Conservative, and Independent lines, welcome. You have 2 minutes as well.
Thank you, Guy. My name is John Budelman. I'm the Cuyahoga County District Attorney. It's a position I've been honored and privileged to serve our community in for the last 12 years, and I am seeking re-election November 5th. For those that don't know me, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I attended Johns Hopkins University undergraduate and received my bachelor's, earned my Juris Doctor from the George Washington University National Law Center. I was hired by the Cuyahoga County District Attorney's Office in 1995 and promoted to Chief Assistant District Attorney later that same year, a position I served in for over 12 years. I am honored to work with a group of experienced prosecutors and professionals. In the 27 years I've been prosecuting, I've prosecuted literally thousands of serious felony cases, tried over 100 felony trials to guilty verdict. I am proud to have been endorsed by the entire local law enforcement community, including the Auburn Police Department, Auburn Professional Firefighters, the Cuyahoga County Sheriff's employees, New York State Police investigators, Council 82 representing law enforcement statewide, as well as the Auburn Correctional Facility and Cuyahoga Correctional Facility lieutenants unions. Beyond working in the DA's office, I've dedicated my spare time to helping our community the last 21 years, serving on 6 different not-for-profit boards, and teaching laws of evidence right here at Cuyahoga Community College to the criminal justice students. And on November 5th, I'd respectfully ask you to put me back to work as your district attorney.
Thank you, sir. We'll now have questions from Mr. Boyer. He can ask them of either of you about specific items or to both of you, and if they're to both, we'll rotate back and forth. If it's to both, starting off, it'll start with Mr. Turturro and go back and forth. Mr. Boyer, welcome.
Okay. Thank you both for coming to do this. I really appreciate it, and I know the viewers at home and Mr. Cosentino does as well. I'm going to start by, I'd like to talk about experience, because certainly you both bring different experience to this campaign. So I'll start with Mr. Turturro. In your case, your opponent, Mr. Budelman, has held this post for nearly 12 years and been a prosecutor for more than 25, where you haven't had prosecutorial experience. So what do you say to voters who may think that's a weakness on your part?
It's a great question. Mr. Budelman is absolutely correct in that he has an enormous amount of prosecutorial experience. In fact, apart from a 6-month internship that he did in his home county of Madison, working for the Cayuga County District Attorney's Office is the only job that Mr. Budelman's ever had. In fact, collecting a paycheck from the taxpayers of Cayuga County is the only thing that he's ever done. It's the only thing that he knows how to do. In my practice, I have represented a vast array of defendants and plaintiffs in both civil and criminal actions. I've handled trials and cases through settlement or a disposition by a jury or a judge at the town, the city, the county, and in fact the federal level. I've practiced in almost every county, from Otsego County, far to the east, to Erie County, where Buffalo is. I've practiced in Watertown and Binghamton, and I've practiced almost every place in between, from Judge Cook over in Yates County to the District Attorney McNamara in Oneida County. I'm familiar with a number of different places across the state where there are different ways of local practice, and that diversity of experience is, I believe, what gives me the right footing to be able to come into a community in crisis, to be able to bring the outside solutions that we need. The simple fact of the matter is, what Mr. Budelman has been doing for the last 12 years isn't working, and we need a new approach.
Before I turn to Mr. Budelman, are you reformatting this question for Mr. Budelman, or is this for both?
Yeah, so I mean, I think what you could do if you would like to weigh in on Mr. Turturro's
We'll
experience.
give you 1 minute, and then we'll have a question for Mr.
Right.
Budelman. I'm sorry. Sorry to clarify that.
Sure. Well, as Mr. Turturro has indicated, the question here is about being a district attorney. And the truth is I've had 27 years experience prosecuting crimes. My opponent has not prosecuted a single case. In fact, he has not had a single successful felony trial, whereas I've had over 100 of them right here in Cayuga County. I have a very long track record. I'm a very proven commodity. That's why the law enforcement community has endorsed me and not my opponent. With regard to my opponent's claims of experience, he's been practicing less than 10 years. The first 6 were spent doing bankruptcy. The last 3 as criminal law. And so I think it's a pretty clear division between his experience and my experience.
Mr. Turturro, it looks like you want to respond. You'll have 1 minute for that.
Thank you. Well, there's 2 issues. First of all, if a prosecutor is doing his job competently, then a defense attorney should never be able to win a trial. Okay? Because as a prosecutor, you know that you only bring cases to trial that you have the evidence to support. Okay, the fact of the matter is John Budelman has lost 2 of his last 3 trials, and that's because he takes cases to trial without knowing whether or not he can support them, or he simply mishandles those cases. Okay, I think that's a professionalism issue. He's also bandied about his endorsements. The fact of the matter is the Local 82 Corrections Officers Lieutenants Union represents a handful of lieutenants across the two unions. The New York State Corrections Officers Benevolent Association and the Cayuga County Sheriff's Benevolent Association both invited both of us to interview, and both of those important boots-on-the-ground law enforcement agencies declined to make an endorsement in this election. That should not be seen as a rejection of my candidacy. Law enforcement unions typically will only endorse a Republican. It should be considered a vote of no confidence in Mr. Budelman.
Thank you, Mr. Turturro. Mr. Budelman, I'll give you a minute if you wish.
Thank you. Well, first of all, pretty much everything my opponent just indicated is false. I've never lost a trial in Cayuga County. I've had a guilty verdict in every case I've taken, so I don't know what cases he's referring to. That said, that doesn't mean that you're a good prosecutor or not a good prosecutor. The cases that go to trial are the tough cases. The ones that are slam dunks are pled out. The ones that aren't there never get that far. So it's always the challenging cases that go to trial. With regard to the unions, he's mentioned that haven't endorsed anybody in this race. They both have new union stewards, and although I've enjoyed the last 3 times I've run both endorsements, this time they didn't endorse anybody. They didn't endorse me, legislative candidates, mayors, city council, judges, anybody. So it's not an issue of satisfaction or not.
Okay, thank you. We'll now turn to Mr. Boyer. I'm thinking you have a second question.
So yeah, so the follow, or not the follow-up, but to Mr. Budelman, in your experience, one thing when you have an incumbent who's been in there as long as you have, and you being in the office as long as you have, a voter might say, hey, isn't it time for a fresh perspective? Get someone in there who can see things in a totally different way. What do you say to voters who think it's just, there's only so many terms that an elected official should have?
Well, I don't necessarily disagree that people should outstay their welcome. My concern is with a politician versus an elected official. Someone who's in there just to get themselves elected should not be sticking around. Someone who's in there doing a good job, that is an aggressive, well-respected elected official, I think as long as they're continuing to do a good job, should be returned to office. The nature of my job is a highly complex job. It takes a solid 2 years before a prosecutor becomes able to try a felony case. It takes many years before they're good at it, or they can try a complicated felony case with, say, 20 or 30 witnesses and 200 or 300 exhibits. It's quite a challenging occupation. So the idea that someone can get in and get out in a term or two would belie the fact that you need serious expertise. Further, you want someone there that is experienced, that can help guide, because the nature of district attorney's offices is generally you have younger attorneys who need to train. Once they become trained, they normally move for a higher salary position somewhere else out of the office. So I think having the longevity that we have in our office is a very big boon to the taxpayers. That said, I have been prosecuting drug cases for 25 years. And in that time, I have seen society change. We have changed. We instituted our first drug courts in the 90s, our last drug courts in the mid-2006, 7, 8 range. We have a series of drug courts now: the Alternative Treatment Court, Felony Drug Court, Judicial Diversion Court, misdemeanor drug courts, as well as behavioral health courts, which are for mentally ill issues, and we have monitoring courts for domestic violence and so on. So we have taken advantage of a lot of the newer aspects of that, and we divert a tremendous number of defendants now, because, again, our goal, good people can make bad decisions. Our goal is to get them into a position where they're not making any more bad decisions. So if the drugs are the basis of the new crimes, if we can treat that symptom, we can stop the problem.
Thank you, Mr. Budelman. Mr. Turturro, you'll have 1 minute on this issue.
Sure, thank you. Well, I think it's interesting that Mr. Budelman first points to one consequence of his experience in the office as young associates moving up and training out. One interesting statistic is that in the last 7 years, 11 assistant district attorneys have left Mr. Budelman's office. I don't think that that's a matter of training. I don't think his training math checks out if it takes 2 years just to learn how to handle a felony case. I think that the people of Cayuga County are deserved an answer on where all of these people are going and why Mr. Budelman can't keep a fully staffed office running in our county. I think it's a matter of mismanagement, and I think it's a matter of professionalism. With respect to well, that's all I'll end there. Thank you.
Mr. Budelman, do you wish to respond?
Certainly, thank
You'll
you.
have 1 minute.
First of all, again, my opponent is wrong. I've been district attorney 12 years, not 7, and we haven't lost 11 assistant district attorneys. That said, anyone who's been around business knows that turnover is part of the business. Our people leave for a variety of reasons in every industry. Some for money. I've had 2 ADAs leave for raises of over $25,000. I can't compete as a county employer with that kind of issues. I've had others leave for geographic reasons. They wanted to move to another place like Ithaca. And sadly, we've had one who had a career-ending medical condition, which I don't want to go into, but he's not been able to get back to work. One of the employees who has left the office, although not an ADA, was ill for some time and passed away this past summer, sadly. So there are a lot of reasons that people leave, but it's not because of a lack of anything, as I just indicated. We have experienced prosecutors and dedicated professionals working at the DA's office.
Mr. Turturro, you'll have 1 minute if you wish. Or no?
Well, if I can just take a few seconds here on that. I think that matters of staffing and numbers are something that's easily verifiable. From the departure of Mr. Canzano, Mr. Schlecht, Mr. Kelly, obviously, I'm not counting in my number the ADA who fell ill, but anyone can check the newspaper articles. There's a press release every time someone's hired, and you can check the website to see who's there right now. And my number is correct, so I don't know why Mr. Budelman insists on trying to skew the facts.
You've mentioned 3 names, Tom.
Okay. Well, we can go through Mr. Canzano, Schlecht, Bowersfeld, Rosencrantz, Kelly, Eshkol, Bennett, how many is that? 8?
Mr. Bennett hasn't left the office. He's been activated by the military. He's on a six-month activation.
Let me interrupt now. I'm going to turn it to Mr. If you want to come back to this in your other time, that's fine. I'm going to turn it back to Mr. Boyer.
Okay, and just to try to keep things moving along, I would like to ask a series of questions about different kinds of cases. And I think these 3 kinds of cases are ones that we see with frequency. And so I'd just like to ask you both about sort of your thoughts on how to prosecute those, how to approach this kind of crime in our community. The first one, which you both touched on already, is the drug and opioid epidemic that we've seen here in recent years. And basically, the question I have for both of you is what is the DA office's role in combating the issue in the community, and how do you measure or track success in that effort?
Mr. Budelman, you'll have 2 minutes on this.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I have been prosecuting drug crimes in our community for the last 25 years. And that is certainly a component in addressing the drug epidemic by keeping the drug dealers off the street and limiting the supply of drugs to our community. We're hopefully limiting the number of future addicts that are created. But you can't prosecute your way out of a problem like this. And before I go much further, I just want to step back a minute and address one of Mr. Turturro's claims. The opioid crisis isn't Auburn or Cuyahoga County or even New York State. It's nationwide and worldwide. It took many years to get here, and it's been around for a number of years, which leads into the other things that I've been doing to try to combat the opioid crisis, which is working with community partners. One of the other components you have to do is you have to treat people who are addicted. Someone who's become addicted to drugs, and 60% of people addicted to opioids now started on a doctor's prescription. They need treatment. You can't just say, okay, stop using, and expect that they're going to get better. You need to have places where they go for detoxification, because it's a very bad ordeal to go through it. And you need to have support and treatment, halfway houses, things that we haven't had that we're starting to get now, which is great. And so I'm thrilled to be working with groups like HEAL and Nick's Ride, because the third part is not only just helping people get into treatment and finding beds and detox, but it's education. So you need to stop the supply, treat the people addicted, but the only way long-term out of this issue is to stop people from starting before they get there. So I was thrilled a few years ago, my friends started these different groups, and we were able to get into the high schools. Every high school in the county we got into. We even got into some of the middle schools, which is where kids are starting to make form their opinions about illicit substances and drug use. So we have been more successful than the surrounding counties in curbing the deaths associated with the opioid crisis, but there's still far more to do. I've been working hard to eliminate the stigma and to try to increase awareness so that people don't suffer and lose their loved ones.
All right, thank you, Mr. Budelman. Mr. Turturro, you'll have 2 minutes on this issue of the role of the DA's office in fighting the opioid and addiction issues.
Sure. Well, the primary role of the district attorney's office is to keep our people safe, to keep our neighborhoods safe, to make our community safe. And one of the chief ways that we do that is through reducing recidivism. One of the primary goals of the district attorney's office, therefore, is not simply to punish crime, but to figure out ways to prevent people from reoffending. And when we have drug-fueled crime, whether it's a burglary, a robbery, or simple possession and use, we have to look at the underlying causes, and we have to be focused on a complete approach. One thing that I'm focused on doing is looking at other solutions that have succeeded nationally. One paper that I look to is a white paper by the National District Attorneys Association. Okay, and this document, which was prepared by a national group on October 12, 2018, outlines the steps that district attorneys across the country can take to specifically combat the opioid epidemic. Okay, and in paragraph 1 of page 1 is expanding the role of drug courts, and that's something that we have to do. Statistics have shown, and the statistics referred to in this document, again, prepared by prosecutors for prosecutors, show that individuals are 6 times more likely to remain clean if they are given treatment rather than straight incarceration. Okay, that's the goal. The goal is to make it so that when someone comes out of jail, if they have to go into jail, when someone comes out of prison, to prevent them from reoffending. Okay, only through preventing that second crime and that third crime, okay, can we keep our community safe, and that needs to be the priority of the district attorney.
Mr. Budelman, you'll have 1 minute.
Thank you. And that's one of the reasons that I'm very proud to have been involved with the formation of our felony treatment courts and been working with our treatment courts for the last 20 years. I've also been working to try to reduce the stigma associated with drug addiction. Very many people are afraid to reach out and get help to address their addiction because they feel they'll be judged, they'll embarrass their family, their community themselves. So one of the things we have to do is understand that, again, 60% of people addicted to opioids started with a prescription from a doctor and ended up, when I stopped the pills availability, moving to illicit substances such as heroin. In the old days, you needed a needle, and that was a great barrier for people getting started because people don't like needles. Unfortunately, the new heroin is so pure that you can get there without that. So I absolutely agree that use of innovative things such as drug courts to assist with treatment is absolutely critical to getting people to stop. And the reality is that drugs are the locomotive that drive the crime train, as my old boss used to tell me.
Mr. Boyer.
Next crime, or classification, I guess, in domestic violence is a kind of crime. Unfortunately, we see quite a bit of, and handling those can be a challenge as well. So basically the same kind of question for both of you is what's the DA's office role in combating domestic violence? I know today is a day when we had a large group out at the courthouse raising awareness about that issue in our community. So what is the DA's role, and how do you measure and track success in dealing with that?
Mr. Turturro, you'll have 2 minutes on, and then the district attorney.
Thank you. Well, of course, domestic violence is an incredibly important and serious offense. And it's not just, I don't know if you're going this later, but we also have sexual abuse in the home, which is a form of domestic violence, I believe. Domestic violence affects an incredible number of people. The district attorney's office is not only to prosecute offenders, okay, but to advocate for victims, okay, and affected parties. Without effective advocacy, without creating a space where victims feel that they're safe to come forward, where victims feel that they'll be taken seriously, where victims feel like they will be heard and protected, then we can't have effective enforcement of law. We can't have effective protection for people who need it. A lot of times, domestic violence can be addressed through education, but not always. And violent offenders need to be treated seriously so that they don't feel like they have the opportunity to reoffend. The excuse that it's my first offense or that it's my first time, I don't think should be a justification for a lenient plea deal. One concern that I have consistently had with the current district attorney's approach is, as Mr. Budelman said a few minutes ago, slam dunk cases get plea deals. And I don't think that even a strong case necessarily has a plea deal. Prosecution, the purpose of incarceration is not simply to obtain justice for the victim, but to protect all of the community. And sometimes we need to say, no, we're not going to offer a plea deal in this case. We're going to have a trial because we want to seek the maximum sentence, and we need to do more of that.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Budelman. You'll have 2 minutes on this issue of domestic violence.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I didn't say plea deal. I said they plead guilty if it's a slam dunk case. But I'm glad you brought this up because it is today is Domestic Violence Awareness Day, October 24th, and it is one of the more complex issues facing our community. It's widespread. Sadly, during my 12 years as district attorney, I've had to try a number of domestic violence homicide cases as well as some serious assault cases, one of which I was in the middle of trying when my opponent announced this year. I started working on domestic violence cases in about 1996. I was working with what was then called the Domestic Violence Enders, or DOVE Coalition. Now it's the Coalition Against Domestic Violence. One of the first things we did was talk to police officers because the nature of domestic violence is, as I said, highly complex, and it can be very frustrating for people that see the same individuals over and over. And so we educated them about some of the factors that go into it, why people don't leave, monetary, fear, children, animals, bills, assets, safety. Ultimately, what has developed over the years we've been doing this is the idea of trying to remove the victim from the middle of it. So if someone who's been, again, domestic violence, I don't want to go too deep into the weeds, but it's about power and control. So if the offender who has been controlling the victim for years knows all they have to do is approach the victim, lean on the victim, threaten the victim, get to the victim, they will come forward 100% of the time and try to drop the charges. If, on the other hand, they know that they're going to be dealing directly with the district attorney's office, and that while we will talk to the victims and certainly are very interested in their feelings, that's not going to control the issue. And if there's any whiff that they've been trying to intimidate or influence the victims, then they're going to be out of luck. So we are very aggressive in prosecuting this. Frankly, I'm not a guy who goes out looking for a lot of awards, but in 1997, the Domestic Violence Coalition gave me a Department of Justice Award for the work with the crime victim. So it's certainly something that's near and dear to me. Again, my most recent felony trial ending March of this year involved a very serious domestic where he threw the victim down 2 flights of stairs, choked her unconscious a couple of times, and injured 2 police officers. He's doing 17 years now.
Thank you, Mr. Budelman. Mr. Boyer.
Okay, and I was going to ask about sex crimes because again, unfortunately, we see a lot of those, and one thing I've observed as a journalist, and when we put stories out there, not every single, but a lot of readers will knee-jerk react and say that's too light of a sentence. I think a lot of people have the knee-jerk reaction to say every sex offender needs to go away for life. But we all know that doesn't quite work that way. Nonetheless, I think it's good to hear from both candidates about how you approach these cases, how you approach vis-a-vis sentencing guidelines and the challenges with prosecuting these kinds of cases to make decisions about plea bargains and sentence recommendations. So if you can kind of go into that and your approach to it.
And I think, Mr. Budelman, you're up first.
Thank you. Yes. One of the most despicable crimes that we have to prosecute is those taking advantage of the people they're entrusted to care for and look out for, those who are the most or least able to protect themselves, most vulnerable. The problem with most sex offenses is that it's a crime that's committed in secret, that usually involves a period of grooming and selection of the victims so that they can be controlled and not to speak out. Normally, it's not discovered sometime later, leaving no physical evidence to be captured, frequently no outside witnesses, and so very frequently it comes down to the word of a child against the adult, and it rests on the shoulder of a child. So they're difficult cases to put forward at trial. We've done many of them successfully. That said, it's always tough because you're pushing a child to basically be victimized again in order to stop other victimization. So frequently, we will try to resolve the case without a trial. We are very aggressive in authorizing arrests and seeking dispositions. The downside of that is if we only arrested the strongest of cases, we'd have a lot of big numbers, but we'd have an awful lot of sex offenses that go unarrested, unprosecuted, unconvicted. I've, throughout my career, authorized thinner cases and relied upon better trial tactics to try to secure convictions or pleas, to mark offenders as sex offenders, to get them on the registry, hopefully to put them on some sort of extended supervision where we can force them to get treatment, but we also have the sentence hanging over their head ultimately if they don't comply with their supervision conditions. So we have a number of cases where we have authorized a felony plea with, let's say, a shock, 6 months, 10 years probation, to avoid putting the victim through a trial. And one of the toughest things is when the parent of a small child comes to me and say, please, we're asking you, don't put our kid through this. And the decision is to let an offender go or put the child through it. So it's very difficult.
Thank you, Mr. Budelman. Mr. Turturro, you'll have 2 minutes on this subject as well.
Thank you. Certainly, this is absolutely a very difficult issue. When we're dealing with sex offenses, we're dealing with some of the absolute most vulnerable of victims. And there is certainly something to be said for the effect of re-victimizing the child by asking them to testify about what has taken place. But in my view, and I think this is one of the key distinctions between myself and Mr. Budelman, I place the interests and the safety of society above those considerations for that individual witness. And I'm more concerned for the victim that may be offended against in the future by that offender who gets perhaps the too lenient plea agreement than what the emotional impact of having to testify about that offense may be on the original victim. To me, it's not a difficult. To me, it's not a difficult choice at all. As you correctly noted, Mr. Boyer, it does seem all too common that our sex offenders in Cayuga County are given the minimum sentence, whether that's probation or 1 year in prison, which with programs they're out in much less than that, sometimes time served. And that's a practice that would end under my administration. Just yesterday, the newspaper reported on a particularly egregious arrest. And I can promise the people of Cayuga County that if I'm arrested, that case will go to trial and no plea deal will be made.
Mr. Budelman, you have 1 minute.
Thank you. Again, having tried over 100 felony cases successfully to guilty verdict, there's a big difference between wanting to do something and being able to. As a prosecutor, we rely on evidence and facts and proof. And justly, juries expect that. They're asked to make a decision based on proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So, we have a great new bill that came through that helps victims of sexual assault reach further back civilly and will now, as time passes, allow them to go back further in the future criminally. The problem is, without physical evidence, medical evidence, admissions, witnesses, that's a tough sell to the jury to get them to believe beyond a reasonable doubt something happened when it's one person's word against another done in secret, and one of those people is 3 or 4 or 5 years old at the time. So I would prefer, frankly, what I would like to do with sex offenders, which I don't discuss publicly, is not legal. I would prefer to put every one of them away so they couldn't hurt a child again, but that isn't possible.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Budelman. Mr. Turturro, you'll have 1 minute and then we'll move on.
Certainly. Well, I certainly believe in due process, and while some people might want to string them up by a tree or what have you, I think that the sentencing guidelines that the state allows are adequate for sex offenders. We just have to use them. And the explanation of, well, they have their civil remedies and now they can go back 25 years. So if they reach the age of maturity 15 years from now and they want to go back and sue their offender, I think that it doesn't cut it with me, and it shouldn't cut it with anyone else either.
I just want to let you know that if you're just tuning in, we're about a little over halfway through our Cayuga County District Attorney's Forum. This is for a 4-year term. We have with us Thomas Turturro, who's on the Democratic and Working Families Party line, and the incumbent John Budelman, who's on the Republican Conservative Independent line. They're being asked questions by Jeremy Boyer, the executive editor of The Citizen. Mr. Boyer.
I can just respond to that last point.
Sure. We'll give you 1 minute on that.
I won't need up. But very briefly, I disagree with my opponent that the statutes are sufficient. The amount of prison available for taking someone's childhood should be more than 4 years or 7 years. It should be substantially more than that for this kind of conduct.
And I'm sorry, I didn't see
no,
your
that's
hands.
right. No.
Mr. Boyer.
Okay. Let's go into the areas of staffing and budget, because that obviously that's a big part of the job, is managing the resource allocation that you have. I looked at the 2019 budget. Roughly, it looks like about a 1.6 million total expenses budget, offset by about $440,000 in revenue. So the question I have, for both of you, obviously, Mr. Budelman, that's the budget that you've been living with. Is that budget adequate, too big, or too small? And just explain your thinking behind that answer.
And this is for both candidates?
Yep.
And so I think it's Mr. Tuturo's turn. Correct on this.
Well, certainly. Obviously, budgetary management is one of, if not, is one of the most critical parts of the district attorney's job. There is a staff of attorneys and other support staff that manage many of the day-to-day functions. In fact, if the district attorney doesn't want to, he never has to try a case. Again, one of the primary roles is that management perspective. A $1.6 million budget for one agency is an enormous responsibility, and it should be taken seriously. That's why it's been extremely concerning to me that in seeking 5 new positions to prepare for new legislation that's taking effect January 1, whether we're ready for it or not, Mr. Budelman has not been able to staff those positions because he's missed the budgetary meetings for the Public Safety Committee for the last 2 months in a row. Obviously, I would think that staffing the district attorney's office and making sure that your budgetary needs are met would be of a high enough priority to show up for the meeting. With respect to the current budgetary levels, our district attorney's office has exploded over the last 12 years. I think there are currently 14 people working in the office. The Seneca County District Attorney's Office, I believe, has 7. We have, I believe, 8 assistant district attorney positions, as well as, I believe, 6 support staff. And at any given time, right now, 2 of those positions are vacant. I can't remember a period in my career where we've gone 6 months without at least one of those positions being vacant. I think that we could probably cut the budget, and there's probably a tremendous amount of waste going on in that office.
Mr. Budelman, on the issue of the budget?
Yes, thank you. First of all, before I go into my answer, pretty much everything my opponent just said is wrong. Moving into the budget, our budget is over $1.2 million. There are 16 employees in this office. That's not nearly enough to do what we're going to have in January. For the last 12 years, I have worked within the budget set for me by the county legislature in maintaining our community safety. But the laws from Albany are going to be about a 20-fold increase in our work. They're also going to not have anybody held in jail, so all of our witnesses are going to be subject to various things. I have managed the budget. I've done it before. I can tell you what's actually in it, not some numbers pulled out of air. And I do go to the meetings. I have been at the meetings. The issue that I have in terms of the contrast between the two of us is my opponent attempted to file bankruptcy. He had $440,000 in his debt that he tried to put on the taxpayers. My son knows you can't declare bankruptcy on student loans. The magistrate indicated that his record keeping was crude, not that of a business person. So my concern is very seriously, how does he expect to manage an office with 16 employees and a $1.2 million budget if he couldn't run a small office and ran into bankruptcy? We have not enough resources, and one of the reasons is that recruiting experienced prosecutors requires substantially more money than entry level. The downside is entry level prosecutors take about 2 years to be ready to do most of the facets of the office. So it can be very challenging, when an employee is activated by the military, as we just had, or if someone's ill, or they get a $25,000 raise to leave. All of those things put you in a pinch because it's going to be some time before you can attract an attorney and some time before they'll be up to speed.
Mr. Turturro, if you want to respond, you have 1 minute.
Thank you. And I would like to respond to that. Mr. Boodleman's primary attack against me in this campaign has been the fact that almost a decade ago I did in fact have a bankruptcy proceeding. And I'd like to take a minute to address that, if I may. And if I run a little bit over, I'll apologize. Okay? The fact of the matter is, in 2010, I purchased the Phoenix building, Auburn's probably most iconic landmark. I am a preservationist. I believe that our old buildings need to be preserved. I think that the destruction of downtown during urban renewal is one of our greatest tragedies. Okay, and so I took over that responsibility in order to preserve and perhaps restore that building. Okay, and after a year of putting every single penny that I had into the Phoenix building, it turned out that I didn't have enough. And I sold it for a considerable loss and was forced to reorganize my finances. Now, Mr. Boodleman, if it is a crime, okay, to believe in the American dream of pursuing a business and taking a risk, then I'm guilty. Okay, and if it's a crime, okay, to believe in restoring Auburn's treasures, then I'm guilty.
Thank you,
and
Mr.
Mr. Boodleman, if it is a crime to love my community, then I'm guilty.
Thank you, Mr. Turturro. Mr. Boodleman, you'll have 1 minute.
Thank you. First of all, I understand that things can go wrong if you over-leverage or other things happen that are unforeseen. So I'm not taking issue with the bankruptcy itself, but the magistrate in that decision indicated that my opponent continued to live a lavish lifestyle, purchasing $138 ties and a $50,000 automobile during the course of this proceeding. If you're going to make a risky financial venture and then try to saddle taxpayers with that debt, you should be living within some means that you can do. And the decision was in 2014.
Mr. Turturro, you'll have 1 minute as well.
Well, Mr. Boodleman's comments, of course, regarding how a bankruptcy works clearly indicate that he doesn't really understand the bankruptcy law very much. And from his background of exclusively prosecuting crimes, it doesn't surprise me that he doesn't understand a lot of areas of law outside of what he does every single day. That's probably why he didn't know that you can't fire someone for being recalled to active duty, leading to a physical altercation in his office 2 weeks ago. But I guess the facts will speak for themselves on that, and that explains Mr. Bennett's absence. The fact of the matter is Mr. Boodleman has a very narrow window of experience, and his criticisms are misplaced.
Mr. Boodleman, you'll have 1 minute, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Boyer.
Thank you. I have no idea what Mr. Turturro's, how that connects to his bankruptcy. The reality is he tried to do bankruptcy on his student loans. He was spending almost $5,000 a month on a credit card. So to say every penny was going into a building, he had just started his career as an attorney. I have no idea why he'd buy a large building with a massive upkeep. As far as Mr. Bennett, he's been activated by the military. He'll be gone for 6 months. He's never been fired or laid off.
So is it your position that you didn't have an altercation with him at your office?
Oh, come on, Tom. Are you that desperate? No, I didn't have any altercation with him at my office.
Mr. Boyer.
Okay, let's see. Kind of building off, and I apologize, I'm trying to keep things moving here. We could probably go back and forth forever. But building off the budget issue is the issue of working with the legislature, and that's certainly part of the job as well, having to work with them as a department head to bring resolutions, get support for initiatives you want to do. So if you can kind of go over how you approach that aspect of the job.
Mr. Boodleman, you'll have 2 minutes on this.
Thank you. Yes, many people aren't aware of that, but as a county elected official, I don't set my budget. The county legislature's role is to set the budget for the departments as a whole, and there's 20-something departments in the county. So our job is to work with the legislature to set priorities and fund them. Our county is a little different in that we don't have an executive in charge. We have the legislature and then the departments, including the elected officials, answering to them. That said, I've been able to work for the last 12 years with the legislature to get the revenue that we needed to fund the office and keep it working. In fact, a number of years ago, I had fired my second employee for unethical behavior, and the legislature agreed 11-1 to authorize a countersuit or a suit to clear my name, which we were successful in getting that done. So I've been able to work with the legislature, and I expect that'll continue. I get along very well with anybody that's public safety minded. The only problem I've ever had is when someone has tried to strip resources from public safety.
Mr. Turturro, you have 2 minutes on the issue of the relationship with the legislature.
Certainly. Cayuga County does have an extremely unique form of government in our legislature, our administrative legislature, and I think that that's one of the most important characteristics of our county government. I think it would be a mistake to try to move over to a county executive at some point in the future. But what that does mean is that the district attorney's office and the district attorney as a department head has to be able to maintain a working relationship with the members of the legislature. The district attorney has to be able to effectively communicate his needs, has to be able to anticipate his budgetary needs, has to be able to justify those expenses and remain accountable to the legislature, who in turn represent the people to whom we are accountable. I think that's an incredibly important role. In my experience, I have years of experience working with adverse parties in negotiations, in settlements, in real estate, in managing budgets, and I'm confident in my ability to work with the legislature to make sure that they understand if I'm asking for a budgetary item, that they understand why it's necessary, why it's necessary now, and why it's the best and most cost-effective choice for the district attorney's office at that time.
Mr. Boyer.
Okay. I think you both have touched on, to a degree, the major changes that are coming in 2020 with the bail system and matters related to discovery and evidence and how that's going to affect the mission and the ability to carry out the mission of prosecuting crime. So for both candidates, I'd like to talk about what adjustments you think prosecutors are going to need to make as we get into that law taking effect, and what plans are you making or should you be making to deal with that?
And I believe, Mr. Turturro, you're up first on this one.
Certainly. Well, we have a criminal reform package that came out of Albany quite by surprise. I don't think anyone really expected it to come out. And it gave us an incredibly short timeline in order to be ready for it. It's going to be implemented January 1st, and it does two essential things. There's the bail reform piece of it, which you mentioned, which will require presumptive release for probably about 2/3 of all criminal defendants who have charges pending. There's also significant changes to the discovery timelines in terms of how soon people are given evidence, and in fact, how long defendants have to have access to the evidence in their case before they can enter a guilty plea. And on the whole, I think while the hope is that both of these reforms will increase the quality of justice and increase the ability of everyone in our community to have confidence in a fair and equal justice system, in the short term we're going to have some significant challenges as we go through a number of hurdles. The first and most significant is going to be training the judges who now have control over a new toolbox of resources that they can employ instead of cash bail. Okay, when a judge was under the current system, in the past system, when a judge is uncomfortable with someone perhaps returning to a victim to re-victimize or not coming back to court because of either the severity of the crime or the resources to do so, they could just throw them in jail by setting a prohibitively high bail. And in many cases, there was no meaningful distinction between a high bail and simply a remand with no bail. Under the new system, that's going to be the exception, but we have resources like ankle monitors, electronic monitoring via cell phone, and pretrial release services that are going to be greatly expanded that, if we can get the judges to use those resources, can, with time, I hope, be effective. This is not a popular measure, but it is the law, and I think the district attorney's office needs to be aggressive about figuring out how to implement it instead of simply complaining about it.
Thank you, Mr. Turturro. Mr. Budelman, on this issue of the new bail system, discovery and evidence, you have 2 minutes on this.
Thank you. Well, this is probably one of the best kept secrets in New York, but in part of the budget bill, there were 3 sets of new laws that are dramatically changing criminal justice in New York State. The first is the what I would call the Bail Elimination Act, not reform. It essentially did away with bail in about 95% of all cases, including if someone breaks into your house. The police have to release them with an appearance ticket. So a C violent felony, they're going to be released back onto the street before the paperwork's done. So this includes people like drunk drivers. They're going to be arrested, issued a ticket, and let go again. Most bail jumping, people who haven't shown up to court. And although there are some non-bail restrictions you can put on them, let's say like homebound detention, if they violate those restrictions, they can't be locked up. If they fail to appear in court, you can't lock them up. So it's going to dramatically change it. And this was highlighted by my most recent trial, Justin Tillman, where from the jail, he was contacting his victims in violation of the order of protection through recorded phone calls and emails. Can you imagine, he was also sending people to visit them outside, but can you imagine when that person's not in jail for a period of 10 months or more? So I'm not sure how it's going to improve any justice. The second part was the discovery. For decades, the discovery has been controlled in New York State through Article 240, which set forth different timelines for turning over different types of evidence, and we had an open file policy so the attorneys could come look at it. Now, what we did in trials, about 5% of cases or less, we have to do in 100% of the cases, and we have to do it within 2 weeks of arraignment. So it's about a 20-fold increase on the work, and of course, the state government provided no funding or guidance on how to get all of that done. The good news is we've been working on making this electronic so that it's uploaded into the cloud, encrypted, and we will then be turning it over to defense that way and eliminating a lot of the time delays. Ultimately, the last part was speedy trial, which makes the charges dismissed if that doesn't happen within a very short time frame. So it's going to be a challenging time for law enforcement indeed.
Mr. Turturro, you'll have 1 minute on this.
You know, one of the issues, and that is of particular concern to me, is as Mr. Boodleman was closing here, on the issue of speedy trial, and that's chronic. You know, a lot of the defense attorneys here in Cuyahoga County have suggested that this new discovery law was written for Cuyahoga County. That's been a chronic problem, especially with the speedy trial issue. There have been a number of cases that Mr. Boodleman has had dismissed on speedy trial grounds. Just most recently, the Jesse Lubner case, but there have been a number. The Bizzardi case, I believe, was another one that I can specifically refer to. In all of the adjoining counties, except perhaps Onondaga County, the new discovery laws have been almost fully implemented for the last 10 years. In Seneca County, in Oswego County, in Cortland County, in Tompkins County, we would get what's required under the new rules years ago.
Thank you, Mr. Turturro. Mr. Boodleman, you'll have 1 minute.
Thank you. As I was indicating, the speedy trial rules are basically the enforcer. If we can't get the material within 2 weeks, and I'm talking about 911 recordings, body cameras, surveillance videos, lab reports, then we can't announce ready. If we don't announce ready, then the charges are dismissed. That's not the law now, and we haven't. There was one case that he's mentioned, Mr. Bizzardi, where one of our employees had an extended illness, and it took about 3.5 months to get a grand jury transcript in, which now we're going to have 2 weeks to do. And she's sadly since passed away, but I can't believe that you're actually going to bring up that case, but that's the way it is.
Mr. Boyer, you'll have last question.
Last question. Oh, wow.
Last question.
Okay.
And if it's for both, it's going to Mr. Boodleman.
Yeah, for both. I want you to. I think one of the fundamental philosophical things that a DA has to do is make ethical decisions, because there's just a lot of dilemmas to deal with in your prosecuting case. So I'd like you to each think about in your career, an ethical dilemma, an ethical decision you had to make. Where it wasn't an easy decision one way or the other, and sort of how you went about making that decision to do what you did and why.
Okay, so let me just give you some ground rules for this, because we want to get to your closing statements as well. You'll both have 2 minutes, and we will most likely move on, depending on how much of the 2 minutes you use, move on to closing statements. Mr. Boodleman.
Okay, I'm sorry, I was waiting for the
ground
rules, but all right. Every day, as a prosecutor, you make ethical decisions. And in my experience, 27 years now, most people know the right thing to do. It's usually the harder thing to do. From my point of view, my job as district attorney, and one of the reasons I love it as an Eagle Scout, is to do the right thing, to do justice. That is why it's, to me, the best job in the world. So every day I'm challenged to do the right thing with cases. not simply to get convictions, prison, but to do the right thing. So every day we have that opportunity, and we've been doing that. Part of my obligation as district attorney is to maintain the public's confidence in the criminal justice system. So if we're not making good ethical decisions on a daily basis, it wouldn't take very long for that to come back around and damage the system. So every day we make those decisions. I can't think of a good example. Like I said, every day, we have situations where, like the Justin Tillman case, he had been calling and emailing, had someone pick up his cell phone, was spreading intimate videos of the victim, doing terrible things, and we had to make a decision. Are we going to let him get away with that, or are we going to try to recover the case and move forward? Which, again, we were fortunate that we got about 3 out of 4 of the witnesses back in line, and we got to convict 20 out of 20 counts, and he served 17 years. But it does cause me great pause when I think about moving forward. New York has not passed any statutes or laws to protect victims from people contacting them and trying to get them to drop charges. And now that there's no more bail, it's going to be a real challenge.
Mr. Turturro, this issue that Mr. Boyer brought up about an ethical dilemma that you have faced.
Certainly. Well, one of the most challenging parts of the practice of law, whether you're in a prosecution role or just a general practice of law, is the daily ethical choices that you make. And when you're representing criminal defendants, as I do on a daily basis, those choices become even more profound. Obviously, in speaking of specific ethical dilemmas, I can't discuss the details of any particular case or reference a specific case because that would be a breach of my ethical duty to my clients of confidentiality. But I can tell you that it's often very challenging to be able to reconcile my personal sense of responsibility with my understanding that everyone is entitled to justice, everyone is entitled to due process of law, and everyone is entitled to fair representation. And one of the most difficult but also the most important parts of my job is the daily balancing act of reconciling those two conflicting interests.
Thank you. I kept it to 2 minutes because I figured these were for individuals. Unless you got into each other's business, we wouldn't be going further than that. So we'll now turn to our closing statements. We'll hear from John Budelman, who's the incumbent. He's on the Republican, Conservative, and Independent lines. Mr. District Attorney.
Thank you, Guy. And I want to thank Community College as well as the Citizen for hosting this debate to give the voters a chance to see the differences between the two candidates. I certainly want to thank my family, friends, and supporters, whether they came to an event, wrote a check, put a sign, or simply a thumbs up on social media. I truly appreciate the support. I also want to again acknowledge the support of the entire local law enforcement community to do that. I want to thank the Republican, Conservative, and Independent parties for putting me on the ballot line and having confidence in me as their district attorney. That said, I want to speak to all voters. This election is not about politics or parties. It's about public safety. And I want the voters to understand that every promise that my opponent has made that he would do if elected, the Q County District Attorney's Office has already been successfully doing for years. Further, my opponent is not qualified to do that. He has no prosecution experience. He's never successfully tried a felony case. He's not endorsed by law enforcement. In fact, in his bankruptcy case, he indicated he was not comfortable trying felony cases, which is exactly what a district attorney does in a small county. I also want the voters to recognize that all of the false allegations he's made are nothing more than a standard defense attorney tactic, and that's designed to distract the voters from the real issue, which is his lack of qualification. On the other hand, I have a proven track record. I've done this 27 years, prosecuted thousands of serious felony cases. I've been endorsed by the law enforcement community, and I've proven my commitment to this community for 21 years. This is home. This is where my wife, Michelle, and I raised our 2 children. And so on November 5th, I asked that voters put aside party politics and vote for public safety. I asked that they vote for me and reelect me as their district attorney. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Turturro, who is on the Democratic and Working Families line. Mr. Turturro, you have 2 minutes to close out as well.
Thank you. I'll begin by also thanking our gracious hosts here. This has been a wonderful experience in my first candidates forum to be able to participate and talk about these serious issues and highlight some of the contrasts between myself and my opponent. I would agree with Mr. Budelman in one important point, and that is that this election is not about partisan politics. The district attorney's job is not a partisan job, and just like the police officer on the street should not do his job differently, whether he's a Democrat or Republican, neither should the district attorney. And I promise you that as district attorney, my partisan affiliation will have no impact on how I prosecute crime and how I prioritize all the people of Cayuga County. The question that I ask voters is, do you feel safer than you felt 12 years ago? If your answer is yes, if you think that the district attorney's office is doing a great job, then please go ahead and vote for my opponent. Okay, but if you think that things are heading in the wrong direction, if you think that the drug epidemic has continued to spiral out of control, that sex offenders are getting lenient sentences, and that there is nothing being done in our community to help make it a better place from the district attorney's perspective, then 12 years is enough. There's something to be said for term limits in any case, and this November 5th, vote Tom Turturro for district attorney. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Turturro. Thank you both for putting yourselves out here, not only today, but also through the campaign. Never an easy process, especially with families. We wish you well in the next, I think I'm told 12 days that are left. So good luck to your 11 days. Mr. Boyer, thank you for your questions and doing a great job as usual. And we look forward to seeing you on Tuesday for our final forum. We also want to thank you, our viewers, for tuning in for the last hour to listen to the candidates for district attorney. We encourage you to go out and vote. You obviously can go out on November 5th to vote, but remember that early voting starts this Saturday, October 26th. Whether you're in Conquest, Venice, or in the city of Auburn, those are the sites, I believe, that you can go vote. We will return this Tuesday, and we'll finish off our series of forums with the race for mayor. It's a three-way race. Michael D. Quill, the incumbent, will be here. Republican Timothy Lattimore, as well as Libertarian Brett Tracy, will all be in the studio to be asked questions by Mr. Boyer, and I'll moderate. Because of the number of forums that we have this year, the Citizen has them on their website, auburnpub.com, as well as you can tune into the college's YouTube station and watch them as well. And I know they've been popping up occasionally on Facebook as well. The Auburn Regional Media Access, ARMA, will run this on Saturday and Sunday on channels 12 and 98 and FiOS 31 at 6:30. And then the college's radio station, WDWN 89.1, will air it after the city council race that is at 10 a.m. This will be at 11:30. On Election Day, we'll return with our regular programming for Inside Government and Beyond the Front Page. Our future guests include Cayuga County Sheriff Brian Schenk, City Manager Jeff Dygert, former New York State Senator John DeFrancisco, who's going to talk about his new book on New York State politics. And we have shows on Nick's Ride, local veterans efforts, and a new health initiative for pregnant moms. I'm Guy Cosentino for Cayuga Community College. We want to thank you for watching. Hope you have a good night, have a great tomorrow and weekend. We will see you back here in the studio on Tuesday.